Well, good evening, Agwini Ursula, and thank you all for tuning in tonight. Now, the approaches to Dublin Bay and Dublin Bay itself has always been a dangerous place for shipping. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. There's quite a few impediments to safe navigation, starting off with a big line of sandbanks that run north and south out a bit from the coast. Now, I'm not going to be talking about just Dublin Bay alone. We'll be doing the adjacent coastline also and a little bit out to sea. But you have the Kish Bank there, the long blue streak on the chart, which is paved with wrecks. Just north of that, you've got the Bennet Bank, just north of the Kish Light. And parts of that are quite shallow indeed. And coming further inshore then, literally straddling the mouth of Dublin Bay, you've got the Burford Bank. And further in again then, you've got just south, that's the Burford Bank there. You've got the Rosbeg Bank, which is marked by a cardinal south by, just dead south of the Bailey Lighthouse. Now, it's only very small parts of that are shallow, but nevertheless, it has to be marked as a sandbank. And I'm not aware of any major wrecks on it, but I know parts of it are very shallow indeed. If you look at the entrance to the port, it's still very narrow, but it's a lot safer today than it was in bygone days. This is a wreck chart of the British Isles that's published every year, and it was always added to. And you can see, if you look closely at the Dublin Bay area, there's quite a cluster of black dots on it. Every black dot represents a wreck, but it's really nothing by comparison to if you look at where Liverpool and Belfast and Cork Harbour and places like that. Nevertheless, there was a considerable amount of shipwrecks took place in Dublin Bay. Now, having braved all of those hazards on the way into the bay in bygone days, the mariner had yet another obstacle to face as he entered the bay. Now, this is Collins' chart of 1693, and you can see on it there that the city hadn't progressed very much past where College Green is today, and all the rest of the parts east of that would have been basically sand dunes and salt marsh. You can see Ringsend is out there on that spit of land all on its own. But the channel itself was very tortuous, and it had a lot of sandbanks and shifting channels within it. But the major obstacle to navigation was this. If you look at it there, that streak across there, that's the Bar of Dublin. It was a big sandbank that was literally right across the mouth of the channel. And at low water, there was as little as 5 or 6 feet of water on that. And ships often had to stand off or anchor to await high water. And when easterly weather blew up, a great many of them were embayed on a lee shore on these great sandy expanses on either side of the bay that are known as the North and South Bull. Now, those areas are literally a graveyard of ships. The first big improvement to get rid of this great sandbar, the Bar of Dublin, came with the building of the Great South Wall. The first portion of it was completed in 1756, down as far as the Half Moon Battery. And you'll notice that there's a change in the configuration of the way the wall is built from there down. It was built, they built a lighthouse first and then built backwards to join up with the first section of the wall, and that was completed in 1795. The first bit was done down as far as the extent of the intertidal area, and after that they simply had to lay down a whole lot of big rocks and build on top of that. So that's why the two sections look different. Now, that helped to define the channel, but it wasn't a complete answer. That came about around the 1820s with the building of the North Bull Wall there that runs out to the present day Bull Lighthouse from Dollymount. Now, that had the effect of creating a great big reservoir of tidal water here, that on the ebb tide, it simply flushed out through the now narrow entrance, and it washed the Bar of Dublin, the great sandbar, around northwards to form the Bull Island, as we know it today. Unfortunately, it's no longer an island. It's very rapidly silting up, more's the pity. But a lot of people have an idea of what a wooden shipwreck looks like on the seabed, looking something like this, but I can assure you that's not the case. It only happens in Pirates of the Caribbean. That's more likely what you're going to see if there is any trace to be seen on the seabed and not under the sand. A good few years ago, a couple of colleagues and myself, we walked the whole length of Dollymount Beach after a great big easterly storm. And I think we counted about the remains of 7 shipwrecks that were visible, that had the sand had washed away from them. And I'll just show, I managed to get a photograph of some of them. Now, this is what you're likely to see. Now, there will be a great deal of that down below the sand also. we went back the following week with the intention of photographing everything and taking some measurements and so forth, and everything had covered up again. But I just want to show you this very remarkable piece of preservation here of the remains of a wooden vessel. Now, this is lying on the slabs out on Clontarf. That's Clontarf Road along there. And it's the remains of a wooden barge, and it's there nearly 100 years. And it's in a remarkable state of preservation because it's in what is known in archaeological terms as a low energy area. High energy areas are places where you get big waves bashing in and you've got a big tidal run and you get sand erosion. But this is actually sitting on mud. And what it was used for, there was an island just out to the right of where this is one time there called Clontarf Island. And it was the remains of a gravel esker. And it was constantly being quarried away. And the last of it was taken away in the 1920s. To put into Fairview Park, which was being created then from what it was a dump. And the barge was left there at the time. And as I say, it has survived in a remarkable state of preservation. If that were out on the open beach, no way it would have lasted like that. And you can actually walk out to it. Myself and Jim O'Dea and John Wilcox walked out to it because from where I took this picture, I was standing on the bed of one of the little rivers of Dublin called the Wad River, that had cut its way down through the mud and down to the underlying gravel. But it's a very interesting piece of archaeology, I suppose you could call it. But some years ago, there was a pipeline run across the north side of Dublin Bay from Sutton Creek, right across the North Bowl, across the channel and around here up to the sewage works at Ringsend. Now, this was for the purpose of bringing most of the sewage from the north side of Dublin over to the new sewage works in Ringsend. Unfortunately, it doesn't work very well when it rains, but nevertheless, and that particular outfall used to go out off Howth, and it went out fairly raw, and it still opened up at times when the thing ceases to work in Ringsend. However, a dredger cut a great big channel for that pipeline the whole way across, and I have it on good authority that it actually went through the remains of 13 shipwrecks, and I happened to see the remains of what was brought up from the dredger. Stuff was being pulled aboard the dredger as it came up. And I'm absolutely certain that some of them were Viking remains. I'd seen Viking timbers in various places. As I say, that was all. In order to go in a straight line, they couldn't have gone around every one of them. So they simply had to plough through them all. The remains of them were being kept in tanks in the old Baldoyle railway station, soaking in water. And that's where I examined them. But that's just from a database from the National Monuments Department of some of the shipwrecks. Now, that's only some of them in that particular area. So it'll give you an idea of the amount of shipwrecks that there are. This is one of the wrecks that became exposed when the sand outside it in the trench was displaced, the sand from around this wreck. This is actually in Sutton Creek, and the pipeline went up Sutton Creek there, around the Bull Island and across the bay then, over to the channel and up to Ringsend. That's Larry Dunn, who's an archaeologist there, who was in charge of that particular project from an archaeological point of view. Now, just going back to 1807, there were two horrific shipwrecks took place in Dublin Bay that, first of all, there was tremendous loss of life, and it actually led in an indirect way to the building of Dunleary Harbour, as we know today, as a harbour of refuge. It was never actually built as a port. Two troop ships left the Pigeon House Harbour in 1807. It was in the build-up to what became known as, during the Napoleonic period at any rate, the Peninsular War, it became known as ultimately. And there was regiments of militia and soldiers being brought out, first brought to Britain and then shipped off to Spain to fight. And they left in the teeth of a gale and got down probably off Bray or somewhere, and they were literally washed back up the coast and into Dublin Bay. Now, that part of the coast there where they were wrecked was wide open at the time. You hadn't got the great sheltering arm of Dunleary Pier sheltering the place. And the Rochdale was washed in at Sea Point, Martello Tower. And in all, between the two shipwrecks, there was about 370 people lost. All hands were lost on this vessel here. The hatches were battened down and the soldiers down below, but you can imagine an easterly gale and totally exposed to the seaward side. In the morning when the gale had abated, they were able to get out aboard the wreck with the aid of a 12-foot plank. The Prince of Wales came in further up the coast at Black Rock, and the captain and 6 of the crew managed to get into a boat and row ashore and left everybody else to their fate. They were put on trial and charged with murder, but they were acquitted. So the victims are buried. They're buried in 3 different graveyards on the coast. One is in Merrion, The other's in Carrickbrennan in Monkstown, and the other one's the little graveyard in Dalkey village. They were buried in mass graves there, about 370 altogether. But as a result of this, there was an outrage over that ensued, and there was a great movement started to build a harbour of refuge. And as such, about 17 years later, Dunleary Harbour was actually built and opened as a harbour of refuge. That's Sea Point Tower today. Very tranquil looking scene. Would you imagine it would have been a much changed coastline since then? There has been a plaque placed on it, and somebody told me that it was stolen, but whether it's there again or not, no, I don't know. See, the cannon has been replaced up on the top of that Martello Tower. Excuse me. But with all of the aids to navigation, as Johnny mentioned, that you have today, and ships not being so dependent upon the winds and the tides, shipwrecks still took place. And the most recent one to take place in Dublin Bay was the MV Kilkenny. She was from the B&I line, a container ship, and she collided with another container ship called the Hasselwerder out on the edge of the channel, just outside the entrance to the port. And unfortunately, 3 poor souls from the crew were lost. That's the Hasselwerder there. I'm sure the visibility, that's exactly as she was when she collided with the Kilkenny. And I'm sure with the container stacked so high, it must inhibit the visibility to a great extent. I don't know exactly what the circumstances were of the collision, but they were simply too close together, and the Hasselwerder ploughed into the MV Kilkenny. That's her line on our side at the edge of the channel. Jim Kennedy from the Dunleary lifeboat carried out a very heroic rescue. He climbed off the lifeboat up onto the wreck, and he smashed open one of the glass windows to release a man that was trapped inside. The remaining crew were taken off by a variety of vessels. But the wreck was cut up by a Dutch firm called Smithtack, who used a great big diamond rope to cut up the wreck into sections, and it was brought into Dublin port and cut up for scrap. There's the bow section up on the north wall there. A decade later, there was very nearly been another major shipwreck on the Codling Bank. Now that's just down at the very south end of the Kish Bank. Now the Codling Bank is not actually a sandbank. It's a big rocky ridge, very, very rocky. There are sandy patches on it, but it's principally a rocky bank. And this great big giant car carrier called the Asian Trader went up on it in 2000. And they literally only got her off by the skin of their teeth, because she went up 2 days before the spring tide. And they got her off, they got her off just 2 days before the spring tide. If she had remained there for another few days, the tides would have been dropping away. And chances are that they may not have got her off. As it was, they were able to tow her off, and she was brought back into Dublin and given an examination, and not much damage had ensued. So she went on her merry way then. Looking at this ship and looking at the ships I was on when I was at sea, I often wonder how these stay upright. And I wonder what sort of, what are they like out in some of the weather that I have experienced on ships that I've been on. To a lot lower down to the water than that. But this great big 3-masted sailing ship went aground in Dublin Bay in 1925. This was a ship called the Hamburg. It was owned by a firm called H.H. Schmidt of Hamburg. Now, she was 130 days out of Melbourne with a cargo of grain for Falmouth. She stood off Falmouth and was given orders to go to Queenstown, which is Cove. And on her way to Queenstown, she experienced very heavy weather and had to run before it up the Irish Sea. And they put into Dublin Bay with the intention of trying to get into Kingstown. So I keep calling it Kingstown. Dunleary. It was changed to Dunleary at that stage. And like so many vessels before her, they weren't able to get in, so they anchored. And the anchors carried away, and she drifted across the bay and went aground on the Burford Bank initially. And after that, the tide floated her off, and she wound up in on the rocks at Red Rock. Now, the Hamburg was, it was a training ship for the German Navy. There was restrictions imposed on the German Navy after the First World War. And it was a way around getting to be able to train young cadet officers for the German Navy. So most of the crew on this, there was 47 on board, and most of those were young German naval cadets. she was ultimately got off and patched up, brought into Dublin, and I think the cargo of grain was taken out of her and dumped at sea. And they were able to patch her up and bring her in to the dockyard and get her patched up again. Now, she may well have been broken up after that, because I couldn't find her in the registers after this particular year. But these are some of the German naval cadets that were on board. They're outside the sailors' mission in Eden Quay. There was one very famous German sailor, seaman aboard, and I'm almost sure it's that young lad on the right there. This man here, Gunther Prien, who was a famous submariner. Now, in the early months of the Second World War, he brought his submarine into Scapa Flow, and he sank the great big British battleship, the Royal Oak, and got back out successfully. Excuse me. Now, Prien actually wrote a book called I Sank the Royal Oak, and it's been translated into English, and I had a copy of it at one stage, and I can't remember what happened to it. But in the book, he actually mentions all about his adventures in Dublin Bay, being shipwrecked there. I think I gave the copy that I had to the military archive or something like that. But it's very interesting anyway. Unfortunately, Prien, he must have written the book in between his various sorties. But he didn't survive the war. He and the submarine were lost with all hands. That's a medal that was struck for him, a commemorative plaque medal. Now, this is a great sailing ship called the Loch Fergus that was wrecked just a little bit down the coast from Dublin Bay in Killiney Bay. She was on her way out to Australia from Glasgow with a general cargo on board, including a large consignment of dynamite. And this is a picture of her here in Killiney Bay. Now, she went aground just opposite the Shangana River. Now, if you're going down Killiney Bay, there's a sewage treatment plant beside the Shangana River, and she's aground just opposite that. Now, this picture was taken from the shore, so that'll give you an idea how close to the shore she was. This was in 1899. So I think 6 of the crew managed to get ashore in a small boat, and the rest were taken off by the Dunleary lifeboat, or rather the Kingstown lifeboat as it was then, in a fairly heroic rescue. There was a gale blowing, and she simply strayed too far to the west from her course and wound up in there. Now, she must have been heavily salvaged, because when we dived it, there wasn't a great deal of her still in evidence. We found part of the box section keel, parts of the hollow mast, and some plating. So she must have been cut down greatly. She's only in about 6 or 7 meters, and that particular area of Killiney Bay is very, very rocky. Clumps of rocks and little patches of sand. I did actually find a great big teak draining board from the galley and a lead scupper and all the bricks from the stove in the galley. And I found a leather sea boot. If there had been a pair now, I would have brought them up and conserved them, but I just left them everything where it was. Another great big sailing ship that went aground in Dublin Bay was the Invaresk in 1915. This was from the Millen Line in Aberdeen. There were several vessels from this company were wrecked on the Irish coast, rather sunk on the Irish coast by German action in the First War. Now, she was anchored in Dublin Bay, and a great northwesterly gale blew up, and the anchor chains carried away, and she was blown right across the bay and wound up in here at a place lots of us are familiar with, at the Ring Rock in Sandy Cove. And she lay there for some time until she was eventually salvaged. She was refloated again. Shortly after this, she was converted into a motor ship, and she spent the rest of her life as a motor ferry in and around the Scottish Islands up to 1933, the Invaresk. Now, despite my youthful appearance, I'll have to tell you that I'm old enough to remember the wreck of the last sailing ship in Dublin Bay. I remember it well, and I saw it. My father brought me down to see this vessel on Dollymount Beach when I was a young lad. It was in 1950, and I was actually 6 at the time. This was the wreck of the schooner, it's not a wreck at this stage, but the schooner Antelope that went ashore in Dollymount Beach in 1950. She was from Wexford, and she was on her way from the canal dock in Ringsend down to Wexford to load a cargo of malted barley for Guinnesses But Guinnesses were still transporting some of their goods by sailing ship back in 1950. A very interesting vessel. She had been built from the remains of a big American sailing ship that went ashore on the Salty Islands, a ship of the same name, the Antelope, which was broken up. And this vessel here was built in the Wexford dockyard from the remains of that vessel. That's a picture of her there. She had an engine, but it was only an auxiliary engine. You can see the propeller there is very small. They tried to get across Dublin Bay into the teeth of a gale again, a southeasterly gale, and even with the engine running, they tried tacking, and they got about halfway across the bay and were literally blown back across the bay then and were washed in on Dollymount Beach. As they took the ground, the rudder became unshipped and it broke a blade off the propeller. The Dunleary lifeboat was alerted, and they stood by all night but couldn't get too close to her because she was in very shallow water, and the lifeboat was actually in great danger of going aground herself. So they stood by until the tide went out and she was high and dry. The captain only lived up the road in Clontarf, and he just walked ashore. And this is some of the crew, the three crew. These are the three crew actually going home. The man on the left is Nicholas McLaughlin, and just by a coincidence, when I was researching this and got out the newspapers and the Gilbert Library, the man who got them out for me, Jimmy McLaughlin, said to me, "That's my father there on the left." He was on the Antelope. They were from Howth. But the remains of the Antelope were still visible on Dollymount Beach until a good few years ago, when the Dublin Corporation cleaned up the beach and they bulldozed the remains of the Antelope out of there, and there's no trace of her now. That's the renowned Ringsend boat builder Jim Carney, who was a self-taught explosives expert who undertook to blow up the wreck, but he wasn't very successful. He just blew a few holes in it. That's his apprentice Jimmy Nangle, who was a chippy in Irish shipping at the same time I was. Now, this is probably about the most famous shipwreck on the east coast of Ireland. It's the best, one that's best known to divers. It's the most dived shipwreck on the east coast of Ireland, and it's the first wreck ever to have been discovered by scuba divers in Ireland since scuba diving came on stream in the 1950s. There weren't very many scuba divers in about 1957, but nevertheless, they found the wreck of the Tayleur. Now, the Tayleur was a brand spanking new Erdon clipper ship that left Liverpool in 1854 to sail out to Australia. She had been built specially for the Australian passenger trade and goods trade during the gold rush era in Australia. And she was built of iron, completely built of iron. And instead of sailing down the Irish Sea, it was found that she was sailing across it. Apparently, the ship hadn't been swung properly to adjust the compasses. The running gear was all stiff and hadn't been tested. In their haste to get the ship to sea and start earning money, she was literally hurried out. And as I said, instead of heading down, she was heading across. But again, there was a strong gale blowing. And she wound up here on the east side of Lambay Island. If you look just above the red X there, there's a little cove. Now that's known as Lambay Cove today. And she was blown in there. Again, she tried to anchor and the anchors carried away, and she wound up over there on the right-hand side, nearly alongside the cliff there. Now, about half of the people on board, about 285 people were lost, including all the women and children. The other people managed to clamber onto the cliff, onto the rocks there, with the aid of a big spar that had been dropped across, and they were able to clamber across that and get up onto Lambay Island. The ship lurched off the rocks then shortly after, and she sank. She lies in about 18 meters of water. Now, she's not very recognizable as a ship anymore, because it's literally it's like an underwater scrapyard, just a whole lot of plates. But it has been dived, I'd say, by practically every diver around Dublin at any rate. I've dived on it many times myself. There was a huge consignment of this sort of material aboard. She was carrying all of the goods and chattels of everyday life out to the colonies. Tons and tons of stuff, crates of crockery like this, a lot of it blue and white. And the first divers and subsequent hordes of divers took tons of this stuff off the ship. And I don't think there's ever been any one quantity of it has ever been properly conserved. Most of them would have plunged it straight into fresh water when they went home. And that's the worst thing you can do with crockery that's been immersed in seawater for so long. You get a thing sets in called osmotic shock, which cracks the glaze. Nevertheless, there are huge collections of this out in North County Dublin and in various museums. Some in the Maritime Museum in Dunleary and some in Newbridge House. A lot of this stuff was actually, we'd examined a lot of the trademarks on them and found that some of them were actually seconds, big job lots that were bought up from the potteries in Stoke-on-Trent, places like that. I own these two plates. Now, I didn't find them on the wreck. They were given to me by earlier divers. But I gave them to a man whose great-grandfather had been on the Tayleur when she was wrecked. And he survived, and he subsequently went out to Australia on a different ship. Peter Mayman was the man's name. And he visited Ireland back a good few years ago. And we brought him out to Lambay on a dive boat and let him see where the Tayleur had been wrecked. Before he went back to Australia, I gave him these two plates, and he was absolutely delighted. All of these patterns of names on, we found out the names of them. The Pottery Museum were very helpful. Now, this is my good friend, the late Jerry Byrne, diver extraordinary and pilot. One great guy. He was the man that found the bell on the Tayleur. He was one of the early divers on it. And he found the bell, and that's it there. I had it in my possession for a great length of time. Not long before he passed away, Jerry asked for the bell back because he intended giving it to the National Museum. And the last time I saw it, it was hanging in the foyer of the National Museum in Collins Barracks in a glass case. And I'm delighted that that's where it went. That's myself with the bell. I recovered it out of the Civic Museum for Jerry, where he had lent it. And as I said, I had it in my possession for a long time. That's the original builder's model of the Tayleur. And I also had this in my possession for a great length of time. It's the model from which all the lines of the ship were originally taken. This is the way of getting the lines of a ship from time immemorial until such time as computers have taken over that function now largely. But practically every big ship that ever floated, the lines were gotten this way. When I had it initially, I did a partial restoration on it because it was in a very bad way. And the man in whose possession it was left it to me in his will. So I've since done a complete restoration on it, and it's now in the Maritime Museum, and hopefully will go on display shortly. And if Roger Kirker is listening, I hope he'll do exactly just that. But that's the lines that I took off the Tayleur. I couldn't do it in the time-honoured way of taking the layers asunder because the whole thing had been glued together. So I had to do it using a different method. At least we know what it looks like now. That's myself initially when I taken the lines of it before I did the complete restoration on it. But a beautiful artifact. There are other artifacts from the Tayleur in existence. This is the binnacle and compass, and something very posh for a sailing ship at the time, a flush toilet. The Tayleur belonged to the White Star Line, which is the forerunner of the White Star Line that owned the Titanic. And she was quite palatially done out for most of the passengers. And there were flush toilets. It would have been a great novelty on board the ship. The thing in the background there is a slate headstone. And there were a lot of blank slate headstones being brought out. There's still a lot of them on the wreck. I've seen them there like slices of bread in a slice pan. Boxes of roofing slates, slate mantelpieces. These were in the Maritime Museum in Dunleary. And then when the museum opened in Newbridge House in Dunnabate, the guy who had recovered them took them back from the museum and put them into the Newbridge House Museum. At the time, following the wreck, there was a fund got up for the dependents of those who had been lost. And it was called the Tayleur Fund. And in conjunction with that, there was medals were struck, which were to be awarded for acts of bravery, mostly at shipwrecks. And there were a great many of these awarded in subsequent years. The residue of the Tayleur Fund was actually given to the RNLI in 1913 to help pay for the first motorized lifeboat in Dunleary that was called the Dunleary. It didn't actually come on stream till 1919. It was actually was built in 1913, but the First War intervened then. Lord Talbot de Malahide from Malahide Castle was instrumental in starting up this fund. I'll tell you a little more about those later on. Now, there are several wrecks on Lambay Island. Just around the corner from the Tayleur, where the first X on the right is a vessel called the Shamrock. The wreck next to that is of a great big French steel trawler that was lost in the 1950s called the Rose Mystique. They had landed a sick crewman in Dublin. I actually knew the doctor, John Fleetwood, who had signed him into hospital. He had, I forget now what, he had a fever at any rate. But I think the Rose Mystique struck the Rockabill Island up off Skerries and sank with all hands. And I think she must have been neutrally buoyant because she wound up drifting south and wound up in again the cliff face on the north shore of Lambay there. And still quite intact, plenty of that around still. The next vessel down from it is thought to be a ship called the Will-o'-the-Wisp. It's obviously the remains of a sailing ship that had an engine. So it's upside down. So nobody really knows what wreck it is. And nothing has been discovered on it that will give you an indication of what it is, because there are a great many wrecks occurred on Lambay. That's a picture of the Shamrock ashore. She was with one of the Lord Line, just a small steamer that ran between Dublin and Glasgow. And she went up here in 1918, I think, near the end of the First World War, just through bad visibility and just lost. They couldn't see where they were going and ran up on the north shore of Lambay. She was salvaged heavily by the Hammond Lane Foundry Company and cut down to the waterline. We got these photographs of the steward of Lord Revelstoke on Lambay, and on that particular photograph there, it said on the back of it, the day the Black Rat came to Lambay. So rats must have got off the ship, black rats, and got ashore in Lambay. But there's not an awful lot of the ship left. There used to be quite a lot of, I don't know whether she had a deck gun or whether she was carrying munitions, because there used to be quite a lot of live brass shells littering the seabed. But the last time I dived on it, they seem to have all been recovered. But the great big boiler is there and some of the plating. The boiler is always the last thing to disappear on a wreck because it's made from such heavy material. But there's a great many more wrecks on Lambay, as I said. Now, some of you may have seen the talk that I gave recently about the Palme and the lifeboat disaster in Dublin Bay. That'll give you an idea where the Palme went aground after she anchored off the mouth of Dunleary Harbour and the anchor cables parted. I don't know whether they parted or whether the anchors just dragged up into the bay. I'm not altogether sure about that. But somebody was asking about the pipeline. You can see the dotted line there represents another pipeline that was brought across the south side of Dublin Bay. And that actually went through a wreck. Somebody was wondering if it was the Palme. But I have the position of the Palme and it's somewhere south of the pipeline. The one that the pipeline went through was actually a schooner carrying slates. We don't know the name of it. But all 15 of the Kingstown lifeboat that went out to try and effect the rescue of the crew of the Palme were all lost in a terrible tragedy that's greatly commemorated today. And by a twist of fate, all 19 people aboard the Palme were subsequently saved by the Irish Lights vessel, the Tayleur. That's a picture of the wreck in the middle of Dublin Bay. You can see that the masts were cut away. She lies on a direct line between the Poolbeg Lighthouse and Blackrock Bats, about halfway across, little more than halfway south. That's a picture of the upturned lifeboat. That was the crux of the issue in that whole disaster, why the lifeboat remained upside down, because they were designed to be self-righting. The hull was put in it not by the overturning or anything like that. It was put there by the Coast Guard and the DMP to bash the hole in it to see was there anybody trapped underneath. Now, a lot of people confuse this ship here with the Palme, and a lot of people have actually published material stating that this was the Palme and that the Palme was shipwrecked in Sea Point. Well, if the Palme had been able to get around to here in Sea Point, she would have been safe as houses. There probably would have been no need for the lifeboat to put out. This is actually a barkentine in 1904 called the Hampton. Now, she'd been owned by McCormick's, the coal merchants in Kingstown, and she had just changed hands, but remained on the same coal run. I can't remember who the new owner was, but she missed them out of the harbour in 1904 and wound up here, up on the seawall, practically up on the seawall in Sea Point. That's Sea Point Martello Tower over there on the right. She wasn't salvaged. She remained there until she was actually broken up on the shore. And there's a photograph of her there. She's kind of fallen off a bit, and she was actually broken up. Now, just south, these wrecks I'm showing you are not in any chronological order. Just south of the Bailey Lighthouse, there was a vessel wreck there in 1853, the year before the Tayleur wreck took place. This was the Queen Victoria, a cross-channel paddle steamer that ran between Dublin and Liverpool. This is what she would have looked like. So she was just a standard passenger mailboat, if you like to call it that ran between Dublin and Liverpool. And she was owned by the City of Dublin Steam Packet Company. She was on her way back in February 1853 from Liverpool, and she was there was a snowstorm, and apparently the light of the Bailey had been obscured by snow, and it transpired afterwards that the lightkeeper was probably asleep, but they couldn't see the light anyway, and they ran up on the rocks. They were just a bit too far north, and they ran up on the rocks. If they had been another 50 yards further south, it would have cleared the bight, but they ran up on the rocks, and the captain made the fateful decision to back the vessel off the rocks. Some people managed to scramble ashore. As soon as he came off the rocks, she began to sink, and he tried to get her around the foot of the rocks there to go up to Red Rock and to get her into shallower water there. But she began to sink and sank fairly quickly. In all, about 88 people were lost. A couple of coloured lithographs here from the period, I think that they were in the paper called The Graphic. By a stroke of good fortune, another vessel from the company called the Roscommon just happened along and launched her boats and managed to take the remaining people off. There's another one of the coloured lithographs there. Now, the figurehead from the Queen Victoria was found floating sometime later in Dublin Bay and is now in the Maritime Museum in Dunleary. Now, the face on this was very eroded, and I saw it being restored when I was a young lad in the old Maritime Museum. A member called Jim Carroll, who was a retired banker and a fine model maker, was restoring the face, and he actually had the image from a Victorian bun penny blown up to help him restore the face. There were some people were of the opinion that he was rather kind to the old Queen, the young Queen as she was then. Now, this is my good friend Roy Stokes, author, historian, and wreck hunter extraordinary. In 1983, Roy went looking for the Queen Victoria. He had researched it extensively, and he found the wreck all right, and we dived on it. And the club that he and I belong to, the Marley Ship Club, we did some diving on the wreck. We were commissioned by the Office of Public Works and the Maritime Museum to carry out a survey on an airlift project on it. There was the very first of its kind in Ireland. A preservation order was placed on the wreck. And believe me, it was more honoured than the breach, because word got out about the wreck. And as soon as it did, swarms of divers descended on it like locusts, and they literally stripped it of everything possible that could be taken off it. Even while we were in the course of carrying out the survey on the airlift, boatloads of divers are arriving over festooned with all of the apparatus for wrecking. Crowbars, hacksaws, lump hammers, and one guy even had a pickaxe strapped to his back. Now, I was the diving officer on the project, and in a very loud voice, I ran all of them, but it made no difference. They just kept coming back. And as I said, they stripped it of everything. There was quite a good bit of the wreck visible. A great big steam engine there with a big beam overhead, a big boiler and a condenser, and the paddle wheels had fallen outwards, and the skeletal remains of the paddle wheels and the shafts were there. That's some of us there. That'll give you an idea of where the wreck is. Just about 100 meters south. There's a line, there's a flagpole up there. If you line up the flagpole with the left-hand edge of the lighthouse and go out along that line, you'll come onto the wreck. That's Roy Stokes on the left. Next to him is a young lad without a beard and a bit of hair you might recognise. The late Philip Oglesby there out on the right. But we carried out a week-long survey and an airlift project on it, as I said, under the auspices of the OPW. And it was a very difficult place to work because there's a tidal anomaly there. And there's only a slack water every 12 hours. And the slack water occurs 2 hours after high water. There's no slack water on the ebb. And the tide runs across it at a horrific rate for the other 10 hours or so. You get about an hour and a half of slack water. That's myself getting ready to dive. And me with the hose off the airlift. We had a compressor on board. That was Roy Stokes' boat, by the way. I showed you earlier on the run. He had a half-decker based in the pool bed called the Venture 1. We had great fun actually down with the airlift. The purpose of the airlift wasn't to find artifacts. What we were trying to do was strip away the sand from part of the hull, to examine the hull. And that was actually my brief during the survey, to examine the portion of the hull that was visible. There was only about a foot of the timber sticking up in some of the planking. So we did expose a part of the hull with the airlift, and we were able to determine how she was built. She was extremely strongly built, very, very heavy keel and keelson, and huge timbers, about 8 or 9 inches square, if I remember rightly, 3-inch oak planking. And she was through fastened with bronze nuts and bolts in places with a 2-inch inner planking, ceiling planking of pine. We had great fun with the airlift. Some of the guys down were bringing down these chocolate coins. You know, these chocolate gold coins. And certain people who came out with us from the museum and the Office of Public Works nearly had heart failure when they saw these coming up in the airlift. That's myself again. You can actually see the airlift working over there up in the top right-hand corner. I'd come up to give directions or something like that. But we did a survey on it, and we did the best we could by taking measurements and doing sketches and drawings just to preserve for posterity an idea of what was there. These are just some few artifacts that were lying around that we picked up and they're in the museum. That jug was complete, and one of the wreckers that came along, it was jammed in between some of the wreckage down below near the engine. And somebody had just got a hold of it and pulled it away and broke it on the seabed. It could have been excavated out complete. Probably one of these bedroom jugs and go to wash hand basin. That article up there on the left is part of one of the fixings, the main fixings. That's one of the fixings of the inner ceiling planking, a hand-forged bronze spike about 1/2 inch in diameter with a pinned head on it, and part of the 2-inch pine ceiling planking still on it there. Obviously, I picked that up, it was just lying about. Now, if you're ever walking down the East Pier in Dunleary, you'll come across this obelisk here. That's a monument to people who died while trying to save others from 2 shipwrecks that were taking place just outside the East Pier at this spot. This is the monument to Captain Boyd and his colleagues who were lost in 1861. Now, Captain Boyd was the captain of the guard ship Ajax, the Royal Navy ship, which was berthed just in the bight of the East Pier, just a berth as you see it there. And during a horrific gale in 1861, 2 ships were being grinding up on the rocks of the glacis on the outside of the East Pier near this spot. And Captain Boyd brought a contingent of his crew ashore with ropes and stuff like that. And they endeavored to get ropes aboard the wreck. And they did manage to rescue some of the crew, although some of the crew of the 2 ships were actually lost. But a huge wave came along and washed Captain Boyd and 5 of his crewmen away, and all 6 of them were lost. And he was an extremely popular man, Captain Boyd. He was given a public funeral, which was very heavily attended. And his funeral took place at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and there's a wonderful life-size marble statue of him in St. Patrick's that was executed by the sculptor Thomas Farrell. A lovely inscription on it there, a memorial poem, and a quotation from the Book of Jonah on it there. Captain Boyd was from Derry, and that's his grave there in the little graveyard that's along on the right-hand side of St. Patrick's. If you look in through the railings, in the little road beside St. Patrick. You can see that grave there with the flat stone on top of it. That's Captain Boyd's grave. His 5 crewmen were buried in Carrickbrennan, and this memorial is over their grave, although it's not as complete as that. The marble rope is no longer on it. There are 3 memorials that I know of to Captain Boyd. One in St. Colum's Cathedral in Derry. The other one is in the Naval Museum in Portsmouth. And I think the other one is in Cheltenham, because his brother was a reverend vicar in the church in Cheltenham. There were quite a lot of people took part in the rescues, and there were a good few Tayleur medals awarded, some of them posthumously, I might add. And I think there are 2 of these in the Maritime Museum presently. As far as I know, one of them has to do with the Boyd rescue. Now, Captain Boyd, as I said, was extremely popular in the Royal Navy and among the civilian population as well. He was a very benign man. He wrote the instruction manual for young officer cadets in the Royal Navy, and it's a beautiful piece of work. I found a copy of it in the National Library, beautifully illustrated by himself as well, and everything that a young officer cadet needs to know is in it. But he had been just selected to captain this brand new Royal Navy warship that was launched in 1861. He'd been selected as the captain of that. Now, this was a giant leap forward in naval technology at the time. Up to this, you just had ships like the Ajax and vessels similar to those that had taken part in the Battle of Trafalgar. And after the Crimean War, a great arms race ensued between Britain and France. And this was a direct result of that. I suppose a lot of it had to do with colonial possessions and stuff like that. But it was a quantum leap forward, because this was these are referred to as ironclads, but that's a misnomer, because it was completely built of iron and steel, and it's still in existence in Portsmouth today. But it has to do with the next wreck I'm going to talk about, because HMS Vanguard was another great big Victorian battleship that sank about 10 miles out off Bray Head. She was the guard ship in Dunleary, following the Ajax. And this is a photograph of her here. There were 4 of these built. They were known as the Audacious class, and 3 of them actually served as the guard ships in Dunleary. In 1875, HMS Warrior and HMS Iron Duke, which was the sister ship of HMS Vanguard, and HMS Hector, visited Kingstown on a goodwill tour. I think that's what it was known as at the time. And HMS Vanguard was requested to go on naval manoeuvres with them as far as Cork. And they left Kingstown and went out around the Kish Light, and they were steaming south in 2 columns ahead. The Warrior and Hector were on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, abreast of them, were HMS Vanguard in the lead, with the Iron Duke, her sister ship, coming up hard behind. Now, a big bank of fog came down, and they didn't slacken speed for whatever reason. And a sailing ship appeared out of the bank of fog suddenly, and HMS Vanguard had to turn hard to port, and HMS Iron Duke, coming up hard behind her, ploughed into the port side of her and put a great big rent in her side. Now, all of these vessels had this sort of a ram on the front of them, and it was very effective in its intended purpose, because it put a great big rent in the side of the ship. She began to sink. She took an hour to sink. And this illustration is based on a sketch that was done by one of the officers on HMS Iron Duke. All of the boats were launched from the Iron Duke and from the Vanguard. And I think there was 460 of a crew altogether, and all were got off safely. And the only casualty was the captain's dog, but somehow expired. I don't know how. But that's a picture of her there, one of them, because 3 of these ultimately served as guard ship. HMS Iron Duke continued as the guard ship after the sinking, and HMS Audacious had been there earlier on. This is the sort of armament that was on the Vanguard, and all of those guns, there was 10 of these on board. All of those are still on board. These are great big Armstrong muzzle loading rifled guns that weighed about 12 tons, Now again, these were a quantum leap forward from the old-fashioned cannon that would have been on the earlier ships, just on wooden, muzzle-loading cannon, just on wooden trolleys. But these were all actually put in before the overlying deck armour was put on. So they weren't actually salvaged, they're all still there. Richard Bridges Beachy actually painted this picture of the entrance to Kingstown Harbour with HMS Vanguard setting sail from the harbour. But it's an absolutely mighty wreck. I've dived it about 6 times. And for some strange reason, the visibility is never good on it. She lies in about 47 metres to the seabed. And you hit the top of it in about 30 metres. So she's standing up about 17 metres off the seabed. Now she's lying over on her starboard side. And it's a massive dive. A court-martial took place in, I think it was in Portsmouth or Devonport, I'm not sure. But the captain of the Vanguard came in for great criticism, and no blame at all was attached to the captain of the Iron Duke, which had done all the damage. But the captain of the Vanguard, Captain Dawkins, was heavily blamed for losing his ship, and he was, the court-martial were very severe with him. He was dismissed his ship, as they called it, despite the fact that the ship was now lying on the seabed. And even the carpenter, Mr. Tiddy, came in for some great criticism and censure. They used phrases like, he displayed a want of promptitude in finding methods of plugging the hole in the ship. Now I've swam in and out through the rent in the side of the Vanguard, and it's about 20 feet high, about 5 foot wide at the bottom, going up to a point. You could actually drive a car through it. So they had very little understanding of what a great big iron box with a hole in it will do when you immerse it in seawater. Anyway, but he was never given another command, Captain Dawkins. As I say, the captain and crew of the Iron Duke, only one officer of the watch was mildly censured. There was some diving operations carried out on the Vanguard. They brought over those vessels in the background, lifting vessels to try and lift her, but the conditions on the site are very arduous. The visibility for some reason is never good. And the great depth, that would have been deep now for even hard hat diving at the time. So it was decided just to abandon it. They swept the mast out of it, and there she lies more or less intact today. It used to be dived very much, but with the improvements in diving gear and boats and location devices, she dived quite a lot now. But back in the day when we dived it, not very many people had dived it at that stage. That's a picture that somebody took of the wheel, the helm that's still in position. And that's one of the capstans there. I don't know who actually took these photographs. But one of the biggest shipwrecks that took place in modern times took place about halfway down the Kish Bank, called the Bolivar. This was 1947, in the midst of a very severe winter. The Bolivar was a Norwegian vessel, was nearly new. She'd been on her maiden voyage to Buenos Aires on the River Plate and was bringing a cargo of grain and bales of leather and some timber. She left some of it off, discharged part cargo in Liverpool, and was bringing 3,000 tons of grain to Dublin. Radar hadn't come on stream for merchant ships at that stage. So, and the visibility was very bad. It was in the middle of a gale, and she strayed too far south of her course, south of the Kish Lightship, and went in on the bank and went aground. She was owned by Fred Olsen Line, which is still in existence, of Norway. And she did carry, I think she carried 12 passengers who went along for the ride on her maiden voyage. She had twin engines designed specifically for maneuvering places like the River Plate. But she actually broke in two on the Kish Bank, and the tug Collymore went out to try and tow at least part of it off and got a line aboard, but they were unable to move her, and the two sections drifted apart and went aground again like that. The top of the Kish Bank is actually quite narrow, comes up to quite a point. This is the tug Collymore that went out. The captain of the Collymore, Georgie Elliott, was a friend of my father's, and we were having a pint in Clark's in Irishtown one night with Georgie, and I got talking to him about the Bolivar, and he told me that the night or rather the day that he went out to the Bolivar in the Collymore were the worst conditions in which he ever had to handle the tug. He actually managed to get 6 people out of the little boat that had drifted down to him from the Bolivar, but the rest of the passengers and crew were taken off by the Dunleary lifeboat, which had come out, and in a very heroic rescue, they took all the passengers and crew off one at a time. They had to surge alongside the vessel and snatch them off one at a time. And in the process, one of the propellers on the lifeboat got damaged, and they had to complete the rescue and come back to Dunleary with just one propeller. That's the Dunleary there, Watson cabin class lifeboat, still in existence, by the way, in Bristol as a houseboat. These are so well built that they'll literally last forever. Now, the Bolivar was cut down to the waterline, I think by the Hammond Lane. And that's the bow section there. You can see how far it's gone down into the sand, even at that stage. It would have been less than a year after she went aground. You can see a diving suit there draped across a compressor on the tender here. Very oddly enough now, there was a figurehead of Simon Bolivar, the South American liberator, on the ship, the Bolivar, which is very, very unusual for a modern merchant vessel. I've never heard of a figurehead being on a merchant ship before, but I don't know what actually happened to that. It may have been brought back to Norway by Fred Olsen's after it was salvaged. Very unusual. But the Irish Lights put out tenders to have the wreck further dispersed by explosives, and this is Jim Carney, whom I mentioned earlier on, a self-taught explosives expert. And he was a friend of our family. That's my granny there on the left and my Aunt Eileen on the right. And when we dived on the wreck, I found some evidence of explosives having been placed, but I don't think it was very successful in dispersing the wreck any further, because it was going down in the sand all the time. The ship on the top there is a sister ship of the Bolivar called the Goya. Now, this was stolen by the Germans. They were built at the same time in Norway. The Bolivar wasn't completed. The Goya was in a further state of completion. And when the Germans invaded Norway, they stole the Goya and brought it into the Baltic to move troops and supplies around. Now, the Goya and these other 2 ships, the liner Steuben and a liner called the State Liner was a Wilhelm Gustloff, were in Gdansk as the Russians were advancing very rapidly westwards in the latter stages of the Second World War. There's a lot of ethnic Germans in Gdansk around there, and a lot of German military and naval personnel, and they were all being crammed into these 3 ships and a great many other ships as well, and being evacuated back to Kiel as the Russians were advancing westwards. It was a Russian submarine waiting outside Gdansk at a place called the Hell Peninsula, very aptly named. And the 3 ships were torpedoed with horrendous loss of life. It's not known to this day even how many were aboard. A conservative estimate puts it at well over 20,000 people between the 3 ships. So it's a maritime disaster that you never hear very much about. I think possibly because the victors get to write the histories in a lot of cases. They've been discovered and dived on in recent times, and it's a horrific sight to see the footage taken on board one of them. And it literally crams full of skulls and bones still. Organic stuff like that lasts longer in the Baltic than it would in the sea, because the Baltic is fairly brackish in places. But Roy Stokes, again, we did some great diving from his half-decker Venture 1. We went out to dive the Bolivar at the site that was marked on the wreck on the chart. There's a wreck mark on the chart. Now, we didn't know at that stage that it had broken in 2, and we dived on the bow section. And when we'd finished the dive, we drifted off it, and all of a sudden a great big mark came up on the echo sounder. So we realized that there was something else there. And during the following week, Roy found out that the ship had broken in 2, and we went out the following Saturday and we dived the stern section. Myself and Dennis Kelly were the first divers down on the wreck, and I knew in an instant that it had never been dived before, because there was stuff lying around everywhere. And I knew if divers had been there would have been none of that there. And in actual fact, word got out very quickly. You can't keep these things secret. And in no time at all, like with the Queen Victoria, divers began to descend on it. and they stripped it of everything that was possible to move. This is a porthole that came off the Bolivar. I'll just go back there one. There was a lot of portholes still in position. And the guys just heeled over to starboard like that. And the guys who got the lower were able to kneel. The guys that got the starboard ones were able to kneel on the seabed. The fellas that were on the port side had to kind of devise contraptions to hang out of the rail while they were getting the portholes off the port side. My good friend Nigel Mottier took some of these photographs on the Bolivar. Now, if you look at the growth on that, that's what you can expect to see on most shipwrecks in the sea. Covered in orange and white anemones, a blaze of colour and fronds of seaweed. As someone remarked, with fronds like this, who needs anemones? But the first few days we had on the Bolivar, the visibility was pristine, very calm weather and low tides, and it was actually teeming with fish. And at very slack water on a low tide, you can actually, if you look down from the surface, you can actually see some of the wreckage down below the surface. It's in only about 8 meters, 8 to 10 meters, depending on the tide. And it's standing up about 7 meters. So you can actually see in good visibility, you can see some of the wreckage when you look down. It's still teeming with fish. There are 2 great big diesel engines standing up there and boilers, and a great big spare propeller down near the after end of the ship on the after deck. But she's basically an open ship now because the main deck line was cut off. The seabed was strewn with all kinds of things. A great big enamel bath and toilet bowls. They all were taken up. They all disappeared eventually. There. About 150 meters from the Bolivar, there's a wreck of a 600-ton vessel called the Vesper. It went in on the bank in 1876. Now, this is the Vesper here. She was just a small steamer that was en route from Glasgow to Dunkirk with a cargo of coal and sugar. And she just strayed too far west. The crew made signals by burning mattresses and stuff like that. And it was noticed from the shore. There were no radios then, of course. And the Dunleary lifeboat put out was towed out by the gunboat Amelia. But in the meantime, the crew had taken to the lifeboats and they landed on Killiney Beach and got the train into Dublin. But there's not much of the Vesper left apart from the skeletal remains of the stern section. Looks exactly like that with that sort of rudder. Some skeletal remains of frames amidships and a great big 3-cylinder engine standing up, but the bow section is virtually intact. And if you look there carefully, you can see an Admiralty type anchor that's catted outboard in the manner of sailing ships. And that's exactly the way we found it, with 2 great big Admiralty anchors catted outboard and another big spare anchor on the deck and the windlass there also. We'll just stray a little bit further south now, just down past, down near Kilcool in actual fact, because it's a very interesting story. The barkentine John Morrison sunk there in 1925. That's her there. She was the biggest ship ever built in Tyrrell's shipyard. And she was owned in Tyrrell's, I think Tyrrell's owned her. Either Tyrrell's or Kieran's of Arklow. And she was carrying a cargo of pit props that she'd loaded in Waterford for Garston. Pit props were the things they propped up coal mines with. And there's a big trade in that from Ireland to Wales and other ports that had mines nearby. And she took shelter in Wicklow, and when leaving Wicklow, she struck the harbour wall very, very strongly, and she was hauled and the planks sprung. And just when she got a little bit north, she began to take water. By the time she got up off Kilcool, she was waterlogged down to and was sunk down to the main deck line. And the crew were all taken off by a fishing boat. Now, a wreck mark was placed on the wreck, but very shortly afterwards, it was seen that the wreck was actually spotted about 6 miles north from where it was originally marked with the wreck buoy. So a notice to mariners appeared to that effect. The Irish Lights vessel Tayleur came alongside it, and they swept the mast out of it with a wire sweep, and then they dispersed the wreck by dropping a great big mushroom anchor on it. And at the present day position of it is marked on the chart, down off the Breaches Shoal, down below Greystones. It actually looks like a whaling scene. These are both from the Tayleur, the hull of the John Morrison. There's actually, I think there's a portrait of her in the Maritime Museum in Arklow now. It used to be in Tyrrell's offices in Arklow, but I think it's been donated to the Maritime Museum down there. Now, this is Marley House in Rathfarnham. And what, you might ask, has that got to do with shipwrecks? Well, Marley House was owned the turn of the century by Ted Castle's coal company, and they had a brand new ship in 1900, excuse me, a collier called the Marley, and it sank off Howth Head in 1902. Literally hit very, very bad weather and took, some of the hatches weren't battened down properly and got stove in, and she just took one big wave after another and went under. All hands were lost except one young lad who managed to get into a lifeboat, and he was found a couple of days later in the lifeboat up near Lambay Island. It's about 1.5 miles off the nose of Howth there. You can see there's a wreck mark on the chart for that, but we dived that, and this is the half model, the builder's half model of the Marley. It was in Ted Castle McCormick's office in Dunleary. Now that's no longer their office, so I don't know where the model is today, but we took a photograph of it when it was in Ted Castle's offices in Old Dunleary. And that's exactly what it looked like when you're descending on it. On the wreck, it's lying completely over on its side, except she's lying on her starboard side, and you land down on the port side, and it looks exactly like that. She lies in 18 meters. Now, some people have told me that, I don't know whether she was leaving Dublin empty or whether she was coming in with a cargo of coal. Some people told me they've seen coal aboard it. I certainly didn't see any, but the seabed has come up to about midships on it. So if the coal spilled out, it would be all lying underneath the sand anyway. During the First World War, there were 2 armed drifters sunk in Dublin Bay. The Deliverer on the Bennet Bank sunk in 1915 with all hands. It was thought that she struck a mine, and indeed, when we dived it, we found that it was completely intact and sitting upright, apart from the bow, which was opened up like a banana. The bow section was almost completely opened up, as if with a mine. The other one lies about 1/2 mile off the Muglins, called the Guide Me 2. And that's lying in about 35 meters of water. That's well dived these days. Now this is what they would have looked like. There were a great many of these, hundreds of these taken up by the Royal Navy during the First World War to serve as patrol vessels and on anti-submarine patrols. They were armed with a deck gun and sometimes with depth charges. They were very suitable for the job because they had a good turn of speed and they had very powerful engines, and they had great seakeeping qualities, and there was quite a few of these based in Dunleary during the First World War. The Guide Me 2 sank in a collision with, I think, the Inishfoyle, a Cork Steamship Company ship, and it was guessed at the time that the Deliverer struck a mine, and indeed the evidence certainly pointed to that when we dived it. This is the gun off the Guide Me 2 that was taken up, the deck gun. It's a Hotchkiss 3-pounder. It was taken up, and when I saw this first, the metal, it was wrapped up in plastic in Dalkey Police Station, and the metal was still shiny on it. You just scraped away some of the marine growth, which was still quite soft. But unfortunately, it was just dumped in the weeds at the back of the Maritime Museum. And the army came out and removed this shell from the breech. And they put a hole in it and drew the cordite propellant charge out of it and pronounced it safe. But I've since found out that the fuse on this type of projectile is actually in the back of the front piece there, not on the nose as you would normally find it. I think it was assumed that it was a solid projectile, but my guess is if that's still in the Maritime Museum, that's still a live round. That's John Moore holding it, perhaps not aware of any danger he might be in. But in recent times now, the gun has been taken in and restored beautifully. A lovely job of restoration, and is now in the forecourt of the Maritime Museum. This is a photograph taken by Stewie Andrews of the original gun mount of it on the Guide Me 2. It doesn't look anything like the new one, but nevertheless, the new, very, very well done. And I'm surprised actually that they were able to get it to such a state of conservation. I'll just talk about the Leinster. There was great commemoration in recent times concerning the Leinster for the 100th anniversary of this awful tragedy that took place within a month of the end of the First War. The Leinster was one of a quartet of mailboats that plied between Dublin and Holyhead, all named after the provinces. That's a picture over there in peacetime. A quartet of very, very fast cross-channel steamers that went from Dunleary to Holyhead. And here, a lot of Royal Naval personnel coming ashore. But this was taken before the First War. I think this was on the occasion of a royal visit. But she was torpedoed about 5 miles out beyond the Kish Light, due east of the Kish Light. As I said, about a month before the end of the First World War. Horrific loss of life. It was thought initially that there were only 500 people, but I think the latest count is nearly up around 570 souls lost. It's also been speculated that the Germans knew of our troop carrying activities because practically all of these vessels carried troops in addition to civilians, passengers, which might seem a rather foolhardy act. I don't know about that. I don't think anybody knows, but I mean, the Germans would have sunk it anyway. But she was painted in this dazzle camouflage configuration during the First World War. And if you look carefully at this photograph, on the raised platform over the afterdeck, you can actually see a deck gun. But it would have been easy to suppose that this was a light cruiser, perhaps, or a Flower-class sloop, if you were looking at it through the periscope. At any rate, the German submarine put 2 torpedoes into it. She sank, as I said, with horrific loss of life. And there's been a lot of commemoration has taken place in Dunleary, rightfully so, for the 100th anniversary. One of the anchors was taken up some years ago and put on this very nice granite plinth. The plaque on it commemorates the 21 postal sorters who were working in the mail room aboard the Leinster when it was sunk. Again, Nigel Mottier, our photographer friend, took these few photographs. I've dived it myself many times, and the first couple of occasions when I dived it, the visibility was actually pristine, crystal clear, and in subsequent dives it was never as good. It can be a very variable commodity, the visibility on wrecks around Dublin Bay. It depends on a lot of things. But it was greatly broken up, actually. You wouldn't recognize it as a ship hardly at all now. Greatly collapsed downwards. But still dived by quite a lot of people. Another of Nigel's photographs there. This is the last slide I have to show you. I could go on and show you an awful lot more photographs and talk about a lot more shipwrecks. Just to give you an idea of the sort of fish that you'll see on most of the shipwrecks when the visibility is good, particularly on the Leinster, on the like of the Bolivar, huge conger eels. I remember remarking that one of them, the head looked about the size of my knee, and a colleague of mine that I was diving with had stabbed a place and had it hooked over his thumb, and he looked behind and here was one of these great big congers following him around the wreck like a dog. Great big colourful wrasse, huge pollock. And I saw the biggest cod that I've ever seen in Irish waters on the Bolivar down in between the 2 engines with his stomach distended. Fish tend to grow in proportion to the amount of food that's available. So the story of shipwrecks around Dublin Bay is one of great tragedy and great loss, and also of great heroism at times of people who went out to try and rescue those who were in peril. Lifeboat men particularly. So remember the lifeboats. And thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Cormac.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Fascinating, Cormac. Fascinating.
Can I just say, Cormac, thank you once again for a very informative and enjoyable talk. It was absolutely fantastic.
Hey guys, great stories about the wrecks. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Cormac, thank you very much. Thank you.
No, in actual fact, where bottles of wine taken up off the Tayleur with the cork and the contents still in it. But I don't know many bottles of drink taken. We dived Rathlin Island one time. And the guy up there who owned the dive centre found crates of Scotch whiskey on a ship that looked the very, very same as from the same period as the Queen Victoria paddle steamer that was wrecked. And he got distillery was still in existence. The name was branded onto the crates, and they paid them a fortune for the bottles of whiskey.
Cormac, talking about the Tayleur, there's an anchor that was taken up off a hull.
Oh, yes, I beg your pardon. Yeah, the anchor is in Portrane. It's one of the smaller anchors. There were two big anchors on that. That was like a small kedge anchor.
Yeah, but
It's on a very, very nice memorial. I have a slide of it, but I didn't show it. It's in the middle of the green in Portrane village.
But there's an anchor on display in Rush as well. Allegedly came off the Tayleur.
Oh, really? I didn't know there was one in Rush. I haven't seen the one in Rush.
Just up from the harbour bar.
Oh, really? I must have go out and have a look at that. The anchors were let go a considerable distance off Lambay. I think the clue to where they were was given by the direction of the cables were still on the seabed. Now, they may have shifted, I don't know. I heard a story that some people went out along the direction that the cables were pointing in and found the main anchors that had carried away.
Cormac, in here. Can I just say thanks very much for your continuing work towards lifeboats. It's really
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks.
Great pleasure as always.
Good to see you.
Cormac, great talk, Cormac. Absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
It brought back an awful lot of memories when you're talking about all the places we dived, all the wrecks we dived.
I'm sure it did, Penny.
And now I know why they were all so clean. You got there first.
In actual fact, I was by no means in the first or second or third wave even.
Yeah.
Tayleur.
It always amazed me.
A long time before that. I was only about 11, I think.
Yeah, it always amazed me when
I was 13 when the Tayleur was discovered.
It always amazed me when we'd be diving on the wrecks. You see evidence the fellas got going down with hammers and hacksaws and all sorts, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't think that what I was trying to explain to the divers was at the time, you need to have engineering experience and take it under the water. It's not enough just to be a diver.
Yeah.
You wanna be in the engineering game and take your engineering experience.
You said you want to be well equipped. No, we were diving the Tayleur one time, Paddy, our club. I think there was 4 or 5 of us, and another club came along. And the guys, they were going down at the same time as us, and the visibility was virtually zero on it. But I saw one guy who was festooned with all sorts of stuff, and he had a big nail bar hanging off his weight belt. I saw him coming down the shot line just behind me. The next thing all I could hear was clunk, clunk, clunk. It was the nail bar banging off the ribs of the ship as he was heading along it. But we had to come up. I had to actually put my fist into my buddy's face and shine the torch on it so we could see my tongue. Up. That means up. We're going up. So we were only down a couple of minutes on it. Zero visibility. We can be like that.
When you show that chart of Dublin Bay in the old days, I remember when I was maybe about 12 or 14, we used to row out to the north bank on low water and ring fish and put the net out.
Oh yeah,
in a big circle and draw it in. But you'd be doing that and there'd be car ferry going by.
I know, yeah.
All the passengers be looking at you, and you'd be probably up to about your knees or your waist in the water.
Yeah.
And as soon as the tide turned, you had to get into your boat and start rowing up the
Liffey. Johnny, there was an awful lot of that done down just below where the Poolbeg Yacht Club is now, down on the Dog Bank. It was called rough fishing down there. And there were several families used to do it. The Rackleys used to, Joe by Rackley used to do it quite a lot. And it was literally just going, bringing the net out in a big circle and then hauling it in. And I saw every kid in Rings End used to be given a hand trampling the foot rope. And I saw virtually every species of fish coming in.
Used to do it for the white bait as well. And I tell you, Jackie Barr used to do it.
I remember Jackie.
Donaldson.
Tommy Donaldson.
Good night, Cormac. I enjoy it very much.
Great talk. Thank you very much.
See you again.
Thanks,
oh, very fine.
Everybody loves beautiful ship models. How about this one?
Very nice. Very nice. Did you build that?
No, it's a wreck.
Oh, it's very good. Nevertheless, it's not beyond redemption.
It looks exactly like a wreck should look, you know?
Yeah, not beyond redemption by any means.
I was given a
nice model of a Galway hooker recently that's in about the same state of repair as that. All the bits are there. I'm going to put it back together. It's a very nice little model.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I found it very interesting. And
all right, Terry.
Cormac,
yeah.
There was a fine picture you showed of the Queen Victoria. Was that Beachy or who painted it?
Sorry, no. In actual fact, that's a picture of a similar type of vessel. It was built around the same time. It was painted by an artist in Cork called George Mounsey Wheatley Atkinson, who was the go-to guy for ship portraiture in Cork. There's a lot of his works in the Crawford Gallery, but there's no illustration other than those ones, the lithographs that were in the graphic. Now, there's no actual ship portrait that I know of the Queen Victoria, but they all looked very, very similar. all of the same ships of the day. Would have been built in exactly the same manner, same configuration, you know. I know the name, I think it might be the Ariel. It ran from Cork, I think, to London.
Cormac, I just wanted to ask you about Mr. Carney and the explosives.
Jim was also a self-taught hard hat diver.
Right.
Somebody told me that the first job of using explosives that he did, he used them to blow up a lot of trees that were around Clontarf Yacht Club. There was great big cypress trees that were well rooted in the ground. Jim undertook to blow the roots out of the ground and managed to do so successfully. But my father knew Jim well, and he taught me how to build boats. And I asked my dad about Jim with his explosives. He said, oh yeah, he taught himself how to do that. So more than that I can't tell you. But you used to be able to buy gelignite quite freely back in the day. My father's foreman did the very same thing in a site out in Booterstown where he was building a house. He wanted to get rid of great big tree roots, and he just went along and got a permit to get gelignite and primers and stuff like that, and they fired away. And none of them had a clue how to do it, but they learned as they went. I'm very surprised that the police would let you do something like that. Are we done then?
Yes, Cormac. Good talk, and thank you very much.
Okay, my great pleasure as always, and best of luck to everybody.
Wonderful.
Don't forget the lifeboats.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for your support.